Good. So here we go. So we're starting off Music's Great Turning Points Part 1, and story number 1 of our 3 stories is about Guido of Arezzo and Little Monklings. This is, of course, my title, but this is about the teaching of novitiate monks, chant and psalmody. So around the first millennium, so around the year 1000, the process for monks to learn all of the psalms was an enormously cumbersome process. Now, this was for them to be able to recite the psalms as part of the 7 daily offices, and for a while there were even 8 daily offices. So every 3-ish hours or so, they awaken and they sing the psalms. And all the psalms are basically, the text of the psalms is basically readings of different parts of the Mass and different readings from the Bible. And they have different psalms that are read throughout the entire liturgical year, 365 days a year. And before the writing of music, all of this had to be done by rote, meaning all of it had to be done, not by rote rather, but orally transmitted. All of it had to be memorized. To give you an idea of how much actual material had to be memorized, it's about 80 hours of psalms that had to be memorized. And that is the equivalent of every melody that Beethoven and Wagner ever wrote. So it's that much material. It would take about 10 years for a young novitiate monk to be able to memorize all of these psalms. And along came Guido of Arezzo, who changed all of this and music history and everything that was to come after. So in the town of Arezzo, this is Guido Monaco, who's also known historically as Guido of Arezzo, and they have this statue of him in the town of Arezzo. When he came along, he had all of these wonderful ideas of how to try and shorten the time it would take for all of these young novitiate monks to learn all of these psalms. And when he first came, now he was born in about 991. We're not exactly sure when he was born, but it was around 991, 992. When he became a monk here, this is what they were reading. So they're reading Latin, and you can see the text, and then all these little squiggles. These squiggles are known as neumes. And a neume is literally just a basic direction up or down, or up and down, or a swoop, giving you basically a little bit of a memorization tool. But it's only really helpful if you already know the tune you're singing. So the way it would work is a cantor starts the melody, and then the rest of the monks there join in. And that typically sounds like this. This is what monophonic chant sounds like. Now, monophonic means there's no harmony. There aren't multiple lines going at the same time. Monophonic, one line of music. And the monks will join in. So, the first thing first great idea that Guido of Arezzo had, and there are many, I could actually fill a whole lecture just on Guido of Arezzo's innovations. But his first amazing idea was to use a red line. And all this red line did was provide a point of reference above or below a given note. Now, the red line specifically was the note F. F as in Frank. Eventually, they would have multiple lines. You would have a yellow line, which was always C. Now, right about here on their music, they would actually have a little F printed. And above the yellow line, they would have a little C printed. And that little F and that little C were the first clef, meaning telling you what range of the instruments you're playing on. And if you read any instrument, you're used to seeing clefs. Clef in French just means key. Well, eventually, this F and G and C, just as a French letter in front of these lines, gradually grew and evolved into what we know today as the clef. So the G, which swoops around the letter G, eventually became the treble clef. But it's all just based on an old script G in Old French. And this swoops around the note G. The letter F, these two lines of the F, have always been on either side of the note F. And today, the bass clef literally grows out of the letter F. And then, of course, the C clef curls around the letter C, and this is the alto clef that all violas in our orchestra read with their music to this day.
Maybe.
So, what this managed to do, when he, just by having a point of reference in their music to where they could write above and below a note, well, now suddenly they were actually able to read music on sight. It didn't have to be read, or it didn't have to be taught and memorized orally. They could actually read something on sight. And Guido, in his book, The Musicologos, actually, there's a quote here that he wrote where he's referring to this. He said, "Therefore, I have decided, with God's help, to write this book in such a way that any intelligent and studious person may learn the chant by means of it. Should anyone doubt that I am telling the truth, let him come to learn and see that small boys can do this under our direction, boys who until now have been beaten for their gross ignorance of the Psalms." Of course, much like any of you that went to Catholic school, learning chants was probably not unlike studying with an overly zealous nun who's cracking you over the wrists with a ruler. It was very much the same for these monks. For 10 years of their life, they had to learn these chants. And remember that a lifespan at that point was maybe 30 or 40 years. So by the time they finished learning the chants, they're approaching a midlife crisis. Now, as a result of Guido's innovations, they would learn all of this within 1 year. Now, this had an immense impact on the history of music, because what else was born with the writing of music? It wasn't just that they could read music more quickly and even at sight. It was also the birth of composition. Composition did not really exist before that because you weren't able to write down the music in any way that would carry on, and you weren't having composers build on past accomplishments, just as it is with the written word. But suddenly, there was a reliable method of writing down your ideas musically. And what was born out of that, not only was writing music a method to where you could pass on your knowledge and pick up on techniques of the past, but also the art of what we now know as counterpoint. And the art of counterpoint is simply figuring out how multiple lines of music sound together. So the idea of how do you write multiple lines of music and have it still sound harmonious to the ear. So here is, what you're seeing here is called 2-to-1 counterpoint, meaning two lines of music that are not necessarily the same, but they manage to flow up and down 2-to-1 and still sound harmonious. And then this is 3-to-1 counterpoint. The tenor line, the holding line, tenore, the Italian word tenore, to hold. The tenor line means the holding line or the melody. And then the duplum line above it, this would actually be called a triplum line if it was a third line. So to give you an idea of what music started to sound like within only a few decades.
in hoc florari gaudium.
Floris renovationis est incitationis.
Saudet vox tripudi,
Gaudiamus osi.
grata quies osi, in hoc florari gaudium.
Floris renovationis est incitationis.
Navi
So what you can hear underneath, there's a cantor singing, so it's not that much different than what they were already singing. However, what you hear when the rest of the monks join in is you hear a drone line underneath that's relatively unchanged, and then a much more florid line above it, which is referred to as melismatic chant. And listen to it again, and you can hear the line underneath that's relatively unmoving.
Odoriri,
Gaudiamus osi.
causam et sorasi, in hoc florari gaudium.
Floris renovationis est incitationis.
And within a few hundred years after that, it did take that long, there were two composers at Notre Dame, and we only know about these composers because of an anonymous journal that we basically found from a student at a church that existed where Notre Dame is today, but this was even before Notre Dame was there. And there are two composers we know of named Léonard and Perrotin. Léonard is Leonin, and Perrotin, Perotin. Léonard the Elder would write 2-to-1 counterpoint like you're seeing here. And then Perrotin came around and started writing 3-against-1 counterpoint and 4-against-1 counterpoint. So there's the tenor line below and all of this florid writing above. And this is what we started our day with today. I'll let you hear this. So you'll hear right up at the top, and the music continues along the top 4 lines at once. So at this point, we're just looking at a fairly strict counterpoint. You see all of the lines are actually moving in concert with one another. So it's a rather homophonic way of writing where all of these voices have exactly the same rhythm. It didn't take too long after this for composers to start moving things in different directions, and we end up with first truly polyphonic music. Polyphonic just meaning multiple lines of music running in multiple directions all at the same time, as opposed to monophonic, which is what we started with today. And then you end up with canonic, canons, just like we would sing any canon today. They started writing down canons and imitative counterpoint, where different lines are overlapping and imitating one another. This is an example by a composer named Josquin de Prez. He's not exactly a household name now, but in his day, Josquin de Prez was the most well-known composer in all of Europe. And that is all I have on Guido of Arezzo. So I want to open it up now to any questions anyone has, and feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question, verbally, or feel free to type it in. But we'll take a couple of minutes here to address any of those. Yeah, I know I could list the slides, but I don't really want to because it helps me to organize all of this. Um, the yeah, the problem with Zoom meetings is if I have multiple monitors that I've been trying to hook up, but I can't, then I can spread all these materials out and keep track of it all. But as it is right now, I have a new laptop and it won't let me hook up my external monitor, so I've got to see everything I'm using. Any other comments, questions? Nothing? You're being so easy on me. Hi, Jen. I see Jen in the background. Okay, good. All right then. If we will keep on moving on then to the next section, which I have titled.
Actually, I have a quick question, Michael.
Go for it.
So if people, this is a logistics question, if people come in late,
Mhm.
you don't have to admit them, is that right?
I do
Or do you still have, you still have to admit them?
Yep.
So
It's not difficult. It literally just pops up on the front. I hit admit. It's easy to
so
do.
while you're talking, you can admit people then. Gotcha. Okay.
Yep.
Hi, Dave.
Doesn't create any disruptions. No worries. And if anybody is lost or they drop it, if you drop your feed and you want to sign back in, it's not a disruption at all. It's fine. Alrighty. So we will go on to part 2 then. And here we go. Part 2, I have decided to call Life of the Party, also known as the invention of the violin. And yes, I'm biased because I'm a violinist. So, the real reason it's called Life of the Party is because the invention of the violin has everything to do with parties being thrown and festivals and carnivals of the era. And I'll explain why thusly. And it all has to do with this woman, Catherine de Medici. So, the forerunners to the violin, there were 3. The first is called the Rebec, R-E-B-E-C. Now, all 3 of these instruments were rather rustic folk instruments, and I'm going to play some examples for you here. I actually have a couple of YouTube clips that you should be able to hear. Marna, break in if for some reason the sound is not coming through or the video is not coming through on this. So this is the Rebec. You can see it has 3 stringed instruments, and you can play it by bowing it or by plucking it or both. And there may be a whole consort of these, maybe several of these playing together. So you can see this is, the melodies are relatively tight, meaning they're only going up 4 or 5 steps for the most part. It doesn't have a huge range. This instrument does not have frets like a guitar or a lute, you can see. It's a straight neck, so it has to be played in tune just by the ear, just like a modern violin does. As you can hear, the material on it was generally a folk, more popular style of music playing. It wasn't something you would see in the church, and you wouldn't see it at fancy court parties either, not generally. The next instrument that's also considered a forerunner to the violin is the vieille. Now the vieille typically had 5 strings, and the 5 strings, there's 5 main strings you would play on, and then there's actually 2 lower strings on the end. You'll see, it's hard to see in this picture, but there's 2 lower strings that are sympathetic drones, meaning they are ringing sympathetically just to create more ringing sound. And usually it's the bottom 2 strings of the instrument that will just ring sympathetically. And this is what a vieille looked and sounded like. So you can see on this far end over here to the right, there's 2 lower strings there that he's not actually playing. They just ring on their own. Now what you'll also notice, if you look at the shape of the bridge, The bridge is what the strings sit on right here. It's very flat. Now, a modern violin, it's a much more curved shape, and the reason it's curved is because it gives you some help in not playing multiple strings at the same time. But these instruments were meant to be played at the same time. The notes are actually tuned much closer together, and you're meant to play at least 2 strings at a time for harmony. Now, both of these instruments and the next are all gut-stringed instruments. These are all catgut strings. The bow is relatively similar to a modern bow. The shape is quite different, but the hair is still made of horsehair. These instruments were usually made of pine. They're not incredibly resonant instruments, though. As you can hear, they don't project very far, and it's a fairly reedy, closed sound, meaning they're not going to play out over large groups very well. They're not going to project that well as compared to a modern violin. Now the last, this beautiful example is called a Lyra di braccio. And a Lyra di braccio is basically an advanced form of the vieille. And again, you have these sympathetic strings on the side that just ring. They're not actually played directly. And then higher are 5 other instruments, or other strings. Again, this part of the bridge is relatively flat. A modern violin, the strings are tuned in fifths, meaning the notes are, each string is 5 notes higher than the last. These are actually tuned in thirds and fourths. They're meant to be closely tuned together for 2 reasons. It allows you to play thirds and fourths more easily, meaning you can accompany yourself more. But also, these gut strings couldn't be tuned with a great deal of tension like a modern metal string, meaning all of these notes are going to be closer together and you don't have nearly the range that you would on a modern instrument. And I do have an example of what a Lyra di braccio sounds like. Lyra di braccio just meaning an arm fiddle, or an arm lyre, actually, a lyre that you would play with your arm, your braccio. And you can see, so there's 7 strings here, 2 sympathetic, 5 that you actually play. Now, watch the way she plays it. Not only is she playing 2 strings at once almost all the time, but occasionally she'll strum across the instrument. And that is actually carried over from lute and guitar playing of the time, that you're strumming across and ringing a bunch of strings, just like you would a lyre or a guitar. So, how did all these 3 instruments grow into the violin? Well, it all had to do with a man named Andrea Amati and Catherine de' Medici and Balthazar de Bozo. Catherine de' Medici and her husband at Versailles were throwing fabulous parties, and they are known historically as ballets. The most famous of these was the Ballet Comédie de la Reine, the comedic ballets on the Rhine, or of the Rhine. But these aren't ballets in the sense of what we now consider to be ballets. A ballet now is strictly a danced work with accompaniment. But back then, the court ballet was comedy and theater and acrobatics and poetry and dance, and these things would go on for hours. The most famous of these, which was Balthazar here, was basically an impresario of the day. He was a choreographer and a fiddle player and a musician, and did some composition as well. And he was the one who would help Catherine throw together these giant festival carnival party ballets. And the most famous of them, the one that is known as, or the family of them were referred to as the Comédie de Ballet, were 5 hours long. Now, let me see, what year was it? I believe it was 1559. Catherine de' Medici's daughter, this little hot number, named Elizabeth of Valois, was being married off to Philip II of Spain. And as a wedding gift, she commissioned a violin from Amati. Now, how did Amati come into all of this? Well, Balthazar de Beaujoyeux was originally from a town outside of Cremona, Italy. And his original name was not this French Beaujoyeux, but Baldassare de Belgioioso. He's an Italian. And he was a fiddle player, and he knew of a gentleman named Andrea Amati who was building these new, beautiful kinds of violins that were projecting more. It was a brand new design. So, Catherine de' Medici, as a wedding gift to Elizabeth Valois, through Balthazar, commissioned this instrument from Andrea Amati. And this is the first in a line of what would become the modern violin. Now, the neck of this violin is actually a little bit shorter than a modern violin, but in many respects, this is very, very close to what we consider a modern violin that anyone in our orchestra would play. Now, so that was 1559. Now, a few years later, these are some images of what Balthazar and Catherine de' Medici's parties would look like, these huge festivals. And there's groups of musicians and dancing and acting. And here's another, this is a tapestry. You can see musicians over on the side and some choreographed dance going on, and Catherine here, and guests all over the place. Now, the problem with instruments like these, as you've heard, as beautiful as they are, they don't project very well. But this new violin, Catherine noticed, did project very well, and it was absolutely beautiful to the eye as well. It was very appealing. So she decided to commission nearly 36 of these instruments from Amati, and this was in 1564. And suddenly she had, basically for the first time, a full court orchestra. There were dozens of violins of different sizes, violas of 2 different sizes, and also a cello, which was called the King. This first cello, this is the actual instrument. It's called the King, and you can see how beautiful the artwork is of these instruments. So these were meant to be dressed up and fancy for the parties of royalty. And then what ended up, I mean, many of you have probably heard the name Amati before. It's probably not Andrea Amati, though, but his grandson, Niccolo Amati. And you can see the violin family here is where this family of violins grew out of this. So Andrea Amati's up here. He had 2 grandchildren, Niccolo Amati, who would go on to teach Stradivari and the whole Guarneri family, Andrea Guarneri and Giuseppe Guarneri. And this is not only the story of the invention of the violin, but this also greatly affected the forthcoming orchestral ensembles. It was only 4 decades later, 3.5 decades actually, in 1599, when the first operas were written by Peri and Monteverdi. Now, Peri, his first opera, was performed for another wedding of Catherine de' Medici's. And the Gonzaga family was there, and the Gonzaga family thought it was amazing, and they wanted to do something better, so they had Monteverdi write a completely different opera called Orpheus, Orfeo, and commissioned a bunch of instruments like this of his own. And now we have Jean-Baptiste Lully at Versailles, and we have Monteverdi in Italy producing these operas. And all of this came out of these instrumental ensembles that were commissioned by Catherine de' Medici in 1564, so that she would have music that could be heard by the whole party. And there's the invention of the violin. Do we have any questions, anything anybody's dying to ask about? I'm sorry I don't have any more musical examples of that stuff. Actually, I do, now that I think about it. I wanted to find out who was the composer that Catherine de' Medici used most often. And there actually is a composer who was her favorite, and this is Claudia June. And this is an example of one of the first instrumental ensembles that Claudia June wrote. This is strictly for instrumental voice. And this very much is how opera got its start. If you listen to early Monteverdi operas, this is more or less, the ensembles were just a small pit orchestra, basically, of musicians and fairly simple overtures. So let me see, we do have a couple of questions here. How did the classic shape evolve? Let me grab my violin. I'm going to show you something cool. Okay, so here's my violin. Now you will notice the shape of, now this violin is not made of wood, it's actually made of carbon fiber. But you'll notice the scroll doesn't have some curly bob on it. The scroll is actually based on an older scroll like those VAs and like the VAs and the Rebecs. Now, this hourglass shape of it itself, they found over time that they were getting a nice resonant sound by a smaller top and a larger bass. It would bring out the bass of the instrument and the treble in a way that was pleasing. But the overall shape, you can see, is more or less shaped like a guitar. Now, what's different about my violin? You don't see these little sharp bouts that come out on the ribs of a modern violin. And that was something that Amati designed. It was purely structural in purpose. Having the violin come out like this, there's actually little blocks in there that help hold the violin together and keep it from collapsing. But those actually minimize the instrument's ability to resonate. Stradivarius actually has a couple of violins that are shaped like this, and you may be able to find some videos on YouTube of Joshua Bell playing a violin that looks just like this, because he had one of those violins for years. And the original instruments, when Stradivarius was maybe in a hurry too, he would make them more like this. But they're not as structurally sound. They're absolutely beautiful instruments. They resonate very well, but they don't necessarily take a beating. So they're not going to stand the test of time as easily as a musician that has these structural ribs on them. So what other questions do we have here? What property did newer violin allow the sound to project more effectively? There was something about the shape of the instrument. It was also the varnish, the type of wood being used. The varnish and the type of wood being used had a lot to do with it. It made the wood thin and very hard, and it would make the wood more dense as it dried. The varnish that they used had all these minerals in it. A lot of people think they used some seawater in it. We're not sure, to be honest. A lot of people have tried to copy the varnish that the Guarneri and Stradivari were using to try and replicate it. But long story short, it had to do with a very hard wood they're using, and that hard wood really makes it resonate. One of the things that makes my violin resonate so well, and you notice this is actually thinner than most violins. It's because carbon fiber is a very hard material, and the harder material, the more it's going to reflect sound. So the shape had a lot to do with it. The shape of the bow, there were innovations in that as well. You notice that the bow originally curved this way, and now bows curve this way. It created a higher tension bow, and higher tension means more friction on the strings, and you can get more sound out of them. Other innovations that have happened since then are metal wrapped strings. But already at that time, they were starting to experiment with different kinds of strings and different kinds of animal gut they could use to make them project more. But when they started wrapping them with metal, of course, they became much louder and more durable. Development of the violin occur in Italy or France. Development of the violin was in Cremona, Italy. Cremona is the violin city. That's where Amati and Stradivari and Guarneri made their shops, and they're still making violins in Cremona to this day. Is the cello you show in the photo still around today? It is still around. I believe that's at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art. No, it's not MoMA. It's the Met. Yeah, it might be at the Met. If you look up, you might be able to Google cello and the king in quotes. That's a very specific cello. That was the first. And you can find where that instrument is. Okay, if there are no other questions, we will move on to part 3. And just a moment, I'm going to go ahead and share the screen again here. You'll get a view of this whole room, our classroom. You can see your fellow classmates for a second. Oh, maybe you do, maybe you don't. Okay, so we're back to our next part of the story, which is music achieves immortality, also known as the printing press. So, up to all of this time, everything we've talked about thus far, music has had to be passed down orally, and then once they did have a written form, of course, it wasn't mass-produced. This all had to be written down by monks and priests, and people who had time on their hands and lots of education and knowledge and literacy. So they were able to transcribe all of this stuff for future generations. But this was obviously a very painstaking, laborious process. One of the things you may notice, if we go all the way back and look at neumes again, you see these little squiggles that were the start of music writing. A lot of people think these are based on like accent marks, and it gave them an idea of direction. And even the first notes, as they start to look more like notes that we have now, the shape of them may be reminiscent of something, and what it should be reminiscent of is marks that you would make with a quill. That's kind of where those shapes came from. You have a dash and a line that you would make using a quill to write them with. Well, the very first notes that came along with the printing press had very much the same look in mind. So a very, very quick rundown of the timeline of any printing, like the printing press, Gutenberg's printing press, which came around in 1440. But the actual printing of music far predates that. There was woodblock printing, which would be a printing press. It was a mass production method. Woodblock printing, where these large blocks would be carved, not unlike stamps, a wooden stamp. This was done all the way back in 200 AD during the Tang Dynasty in China. And then there was also woodblock printing in Europe by around the 1300s. The first movable type printing would be around 1040 AD, again in China. It was the Song Dynasty of China. And then Gutenberg's press was in 1440. Now, his original press has not survived, but this is a replica of what Gutenberg's printing press looked like. And what movable type looked like there's all these tiny little slats. Each one of those is an individual letter that would have to be lined up side by side on the press. And then these are difficult to read because, of course, they all had to be printed backwards so that they would be a mirror image when you stamped them. So I was curious what this said, and I wanted you all to see it. So I turned it around, and when you flip it digitally, it says, "The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog and feels as if he were in seventh heaven of typography together with your da-da-da." So there you are. Those are words for the future. Now, the first movable type for music actually came around 1476, was the first printing of any monophonic music. Now what you see here are basically little neum-like notes. That would be basically a whole note, and that's a half note. This might be a clef or a different kind of neum. I don't even know what that is. And you'll see it actually is included with the 5 lines of the staff. And this straight line is recessed a bit, so you wouldn't see that as much. And then here is just notes and lines. So every line is printed individually in pieces with the actual note. And what this would look like on the page when printed was like this. Now you notice lots of angles, all these angles, these diamond shapes, which is quite different from our music now. Why would that be? Well, music had already grown to this point to be, they were using quills and they were mimicking the look of that. But more importantly, when they're pressing this stuff into metal, it's a lot easier to make straight lines than to make circles. Circles get smudged, they're imperfect, and this would also save on ink. And ink and paper were incredibly expensive at the time. Now, the first name that would come up is the name Ulrich Hahn, H-A-N. It's a German inventor. But these days, nobody knows the name Ulrich Hahn. The name everybody knows is the last person who came up with a music printing press of this era. And as many of you, I'm sure, know, credit for invention goes not to the person who invented it first, but rather whomever invented it so well that it never had to be invented again. And Ulrich Hahn's moving press, like this, that has all these little lines, and occasionally they wouldn't line up, they would kind of go up and down, and they could be a little sloppy at times. The gentleman who we actually give credit to the printing press was another Italian, Ottaviano Petrucci. And there's actually an online database named after Petrucci. Now it's referred to as the Petrucci database. And the Petrucci database is an online repository of copyright-free music. Now, Ottaviano Petrucci was not only a skilled inventor, and he was also a composer himself, but also a very clever businessman. It was in 1498 that he came up with a method for printing music, and he printed the first polyphonic music, meaning music for multiple voices. This was the first time that had been done. Music for multiple voices, and he would do it in 3 different stages. First, they would print all the staff lines, all the lines going from left to right. Then they would print all the words, and then they would print all the notes. This resulted in a music that was much easier to read, much neater looking on the page, cleaner, and that's what this looked like. So all of these horizontal lines, that was the first thing that was printed. And the next would be any words or dialogue that would be underneath the words. All this dialogue, that would be printed next. And then the notes would be printed last. Now this music you're looking at right here is, this is the tenor line of a 4-part work called Goodbye My Love by Josquin des Prez, and we'll listen to this right now, and you will hear, just follow along these notes, and you'll hear the tenor singing that line. So Josquin de Prez was one of many, a group of composers known as Franco-Flemish composers. So even though Ottaviano Petrucci's first collection of music printed in 1501 was in Italy, and he was an Italian, he wasn't printing Italian music. He was printing a collection of these Franco-Flemish composers because it was popular all over Europe, and he knew that it would be more commercially viable. So this was a collection of 96, the first printing was a collection of 96 secular songs, and the collection is called Harmonici Musices Odecaton. And Odecaton is a common name that anyone studying music at conservatory gets to know because it was the first polyphonic printing. It's one of these collections you have to know. Yeah, this was from that collection. Now, within a few years later, though, he did start printing popular Italian songs. At the time, they were called frottola or frottoles. They were basically an early popular song type. What would follow is madrigals and then eventually art songs. And this is a copy of one of Petrucci's printing in 1507 of a lute song. And you'll actually hear there's multiple voices. There's tenor line, altus line, balsos line. So you have multiple lines of vocal writing. And here is that song. And you'll be able to hear, if you follow this way, the musical line.
Che debbio far che mi consiglia amore? Tempo è ben di morire e t'ho tardato più che non vorrei. Madonna è morta e da secol mio cuore ed volentol seguire interromper conven questi anni rei.
Now, when I hear this, it doesn't sound a whole lot different, not that far removed from a Schubert song or something by Bob Dylan. Just guitar and a singer, John Prine. This was the beginning of a whole lineage of composers recording this music for posterity and being able to sell it all over Europe and make a living as a composer. So that is all I have on that. What other questions might we have, if any? And somebody looked up the King. I love it. It's in South Dakota at the National Music Museum, of course. I drove through South Dakota on my way here. I wish I would have known. I would have stopped to see it. Any other questions, concerns, curiosities? Okay, my friends. Well, that's all I had for you for today. That was our 3 stories for part 1 of this tour. There will be another part 2 of this lecture next Wednesday at the same time, and we're going to get into the modern era. So from now we've gone from basically 1000 all the way up to about 1600 in the music we've been listening to. Next week we're going to jump ahead to about 180 years to 1780, and we're going to talk about Beethoven and Liszt and even some 20th century composers, and we're going to talk about some groundbreaking moments and inventions and innovations and how probably much more music, of course, you'll recognize, and composers you'll recognize, things that you'll hear in the concert hall, especially next year because it's going to be a big Beethoven year. Good. Can we get an outline of today's talk? I'll see what I can do. What I'm actually going to try and do when both of these lectures are done is send out a quick outline, names of everyone who is covered, some links online to where you might be able to read articles or explore some of this stuff on your own. And I might even put together a playlist on Spotify. And if you click on that, you can listen to some of the music we talked about and investigate some of these composers on your own. If there's one composer I would recommend, I'm going to type it in here in the comments section. If there's one composer from antiquity I would recommend you get to know and listen to. It's probably one you've never heard of. It's Josquin des Prez, or he was just known at the time as Josquin. But before Bach and Mozart and Beethoven, Josquin was the man to know. And even up until Bach's time, Josquin's music was being studied. He really was he was a rock star all over Europe. And he was one of the first artists who was actually internationally known. He wasn't just known regionally. All right, my friends, that's all I have. Take care. Feel free to send notes if you have any questions. It's so good to see so many familiar faces. David and Deborah, Bonnie, it's so good to see you guys. I hope to see you in person sooner rather than later, okay? Take care, everyone. Be safe.
May I make one note?
All right, go
So
for it.
you'll need a new link for next week's
Right.
performance. So I'll send that out at your request. So I'll send another email out inviting people to join us for next week. If you know somebody who didn't participate in today's but wants to jump in next week, that's no problem. And then we'll send you out a new link. And if you have any specific questions about technical stuff with Zoom, feel free to pass those on to us too, and we'll help you offline. And it's great to see everybody.
Thank you, Michael. It was great.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Cool.
That was fun.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Hello and goodbye.
Thank you, honey.
Very nice, Michael.
Thank
Very
you,
nice,
Lady Kim.
Michael. Everything was beautiful.
Good, good.
I really don't understand all of it.
That's okay. I don't either.
I love it.
I'm used to Pavarotti, though.
Yeah, of course.
I still like him.
Yeah, me too. Well, maybe I'll find an excuse to play Pavarotti during the next.
Not
during
at
the
all.
next one. I'll try to think of some earth-shattering things that happened, Ruth.
What did they say?
Okay,
Have a
bye-bye,
nice-
sweetheart.
All right, bye-bye. Have a good night.
Bye-bye. I love you.
Love you too.
Beautiful guy.
Okay, stop video. Okay, right here, there.
Did you hear what I said?
Yeah, he did, because you were unmuted. Yeah, so they heard it.
Very nice.
They'll hear it now.